Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening begins in the late 19th century. The air is thick with Viennese coffeehouse smoke. Freud's theories dominate every salon, and a bespectacled physician with a rebellious streak sits scribbling notes about something radical, the idea that our future matters more than our past. His name? Alfred Adler. His mission? To prove that personality isn't written in stone by childhood trauma, but shaped by the goals we chase and the meaning we create. Before we properly begin Adler's story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Adler and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next Bedtime Biography. Now, Adlerian psychology gets thrown around a lot. Inferiority complex, birth order, lifestyle, sometimes as pop psychology, sometimes as genuine insight. But strip away the noise, and at its heart, it's really just a question. What if who you become isn't determined by who you were, but by who you're striving to be? Adler spent his life chasing that idea through medical clinics, coffeehouse debates, and eventually exile from his own movement. Of course, history took his theories and ran wild with them. Self-help books, parenting guides, entire therapeutic schools rising in his name. But tonight, we're not here for the self-improvement industrial complex. We're just here to meet the man behind the concepts. A compassionate, stubborn, deeply democratic thinker who believed everyone could change. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential thinker. This is the Bedtime Biography of Alfred Adler. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Couldn't Breathe. The story begins in 1870 in the Rudolfsheim district of Vienna, a place where Jewish merchants haggled over grain prices and horse-drawn trams clattered past crumbling Baroque facades. Here, in a modest apartment above his father's grain shop, a sickly boy named Alfred Adler took shallow, rattling breaths. Rickets had twisted his legs. Pneumonia nearly claimed him at 5. And always, there was his older brother Sigmund. Healthy, athletic, effortlessly perfect in every way young Alfred was not. His father, Leopold, was a Hungarian Jewish grain merchant with a booming laugh and expansive dreams. A man who believed in hard work and the power of reinvention. Young Alfred would inherit both traits, along with something far more combustible, a burning need to prove that weakness could become strength. The Adler household hummed with middle-class aspiration. Leopold filled the home with talk of business and progress, while Alfred's mother, Pauline, kept the kitchen warm and the children anxiously monitored. Young Alfred absorbed it all, the striving, the competition between siblings, the sense that your place in the world wasn't fixed but fought for. By the time he reached the local gymnasium, his teachers noted two things. First, that the boy struggled academically despite obvious intelligence. And second, that he possessed what one instructor called a most unusual determination to overcome every obstacle placed before him. At one point, a mathematics teacher declared him unfit for anything but shoemaking. Alfred's response? He became obsessed with mathematics, mastering it through sheer stubborn will until he stood at the top of his class. That moment crystallized something crucial. Adler learned that perceived weaknesses could fuel achievement, that inferiority could be transformed into superiority, that the future you create matters more than the past you're given. His headmaster, perhaps sensing the steel beneath the sickly exterior, wrote in Alfred's certificate that while the student showed determination, his work suffered from an overabundance of compensatory energy. Meanwhile, Vienna around him whispered contradictional stories. The imperial capital's grandeur masked grinding poverty. The coffee houses celebrated reason while workers starved in tenements. The contradictions piled up like the city's Baroque architecture, beautiful facades covering rotting foundations. Adler would spend his life dissecting such contradictions, though he couldn't have known it yet. For now, he was simply a fragile young man with poor eyesight and a restlessness that no amount of succotaurt could soothe. His father dreamed Alfred would take over the grain business, respectable, comfortable, a continuation of the Adler family's hard-won stability. But the boy who had grown up between sickness and health, between inferiority and striving, was already nursing questions too big for commerce. Why do some people crumble under adversity while others transcend it? In 1888, he left for university, carrying a trunk of medical textbooks, a head full of questions, and a heart primed not for rebellion exactly, but for something subtler, a lifelong quest to prove that human beings weren't prisoners of their past. The narrow streets of Rudolfsheim would see him only occasionally after that, the sickly son returning between controversies, each time a little more confident, a little more convinced that personality was something we create, not inherit. Chapter 2. The Socialist Doctor. The university years arrived like a breath of fresh Viennese air, if such a thing existed in the 1890s. The University of Vienna was all dusty lecture halls and radical student cafes, a far cry from the grain shop's familiar routines. 20-year-old Alfred dove in head first, but not toward the typical medical student path. While his classmates studied anatomy with detached precision, Adler haunted the working-class districts, carrying his medical bag into tenements where tuberculosis and poverty formed their own diagnostic pattern. His medical studies proved unremarkable at first. Decent grades, no particular genius, just steady competence. But something was happening outside the classroom. Adler joined socialist discussion groups, those smoky back rooms where young idealists debated how to fix society's ills. He wasn't a firebrand revolutionary, rather he was the one asking practical questions. How does poverty affect a child's development? Why do some families shatter under hardship while others grow stronger? By 1895, he'd completed his medical degree and chosen a curious specialty, ophthalmology. Perhaps it was the irony of a man with poor vision becoming an eye doctor. Or perhaps young Adler understood something about perspective, that what you see depends on where you're standing and what lens you're using. He never quite settled on eyes though, restlessly moving through various specialties, like someone searching for the right angle. The transformation accelerated when he opened a general practice in Leopoldstadt, Vienna's working-class Jewish quarter. His waiting room filled with circus performers from the nearby Prater amusement park, acrobats, strongmen, jugglers, whose bodies were their livelihood. Adler became fascinated by their psychology. Why did a trapeze artist develop perfect spatial awareness after falling twice? Why did a strongman with childhood polio build extraordinary muscle mass? The patterns emerged slowly. People seemed to compensate for weaknesses, to overcompensate even, transforming their vulnerabilities into strengths. Nights blurred into days as Adler scribbled notes about organ inferiority and psychological compensation. The medical student who'd arrived in Vienna planning a conventional career now wrote passionate articles about the mind-body connection. His approach was startling. He treated patients holistically, asking about their family life, their aspirations, their childhood position among siblings. Other doctors thought he'd gone soft. Adler thought they'd gone blind. In 1897, he married Raisa Timofeyevna Epstein, a Russian student and fierce intellectual who'd fled to Vienna seeking education and freedom. Raisa was everything proper Viennese society wasn't: politically radical, academically brilliant, unapologetically feminist. Their marriage became a meeting of minds and ideals. She challenged his thinking, pushed him towards social consciousness, and made it clear that any psychology worth practicing had to address women's liberation and social justice. By 1902, Adler was a 32-year-old general practitioner with a growing reputation for unconventional methods and a restless intellect. His practice thrived, but something was missing. He'd mastered the body's ailments, but sensed that the mind held deeper mysteries. When a newspaper review of a new book on dream interpretation caught his attention, Adler did something characteristically bold. He wrote a spirited defense of the author against critics. That author's name was Sigmund Freud, and Adler's letter would change everything. The young socialist doctor was about to enter the inner circle of psychoanalysis, bringing his democratic ideals and compensatory theories into direct collision with Freud's deterministic vision. The mentor he'd soon find was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly unwilling to share the spotlight. The hangovers from those early coffeehouse debates would be legendary, but they'd be accompanied by something far more potent: a rising conviction that psychology didn't have to be about dark drives and childhood sexuality. It could be about hope, about striving, about the human capacity to overcome. The mild-mannered doctor was about to become a revolutionary, and his revolution would be gentler, more optimistic, and ultimately more democratic than anything Freud imagined. Chapter 3: Freud's Favorite Heretic. The Wednesday Psychological Society began innocently enough. Vienna, 1902. A small group of curious physicians and intellectuals gathering at Bergasse 19 in Freud's waiting room to discuss the mysterious workings of the human mind. Adler, now 32 and intrigued by Freud's radical ideas, became one of the original members. Each Wednesday evening, as cigar smoke curled toward the ceiling, these men debated dreams, neuroses, and the unconscious, topics that polite Viennese society considered either scandalous or absurd. At first, Adler played the role of earnest student. Freud held court from his leather chair, dispensing insights with professorial authority while his disciples took notes. But Adler couldn't help himself. That stubborn streak from his childhood kept surfacing. When Freud insisted everything traced back to sexual trauma, Adler raised his hand. "But what about the circus performers I treat? Their psychology seems shaped more by physical compensation than repressed desires." Freud initially tolerated such questions, even found them stimulating. Adler was smart, practical, and brought real clinical experience with working-class patients Freud rarely encountered. The older man appointed Adler president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1910 and co-editor of its journal. "Look at my protégé," Freud seemed to be saying. "Look at how magnanimous I am." But cracks were forming in the facade. Adler's theories kept diverging from orthodox psychoanalysis. In 1907, he published a study on organ inferiority, arguing that people compensate for physical weaknesses by developing psychological strengths. Freud nodded politely, but clearly didn't see how this fit his sexual framework. When Adler suggested that aggression, not sexuality, might be the primary drive, Freud's nod turned into a frown. The tension escalated during those Wednesday meetings. Adler would present cases emphasizing a patient's life goals and social context. Freud would reinterpret everything through an Oedipal lens. Other members began taking sides. The air grew thick with more than cigar smoke. It crackled with intellectual rivalry and wounded egos. "You're abandoning the unconscious," Freud finally declared one evening. "You're turning psychology into mere pedagogy." Chapter 1. The Boy Who Couldn't Breathe. The story begins in 1870 in the Rudolfsheim district of Vienna, a place where Jewish merchants haggled over grain prices and horse-drawn trams clattered past crumbling Baroque facades. Here, in a modest apartment above his father's grain shop, a sickly boy named Alfred Adler took shallow, rattling breaths. Rickets had twisted his legs. Pneumonia nearly claimed him at 5. And always, there was his older brother Sigmund. Healthy, athletic, effortlessly perfect in every way young Alfred was not. His father, Leopold, was a Hungarian Jewish grain merchant with a booming laugh and expansive dreams. A man who believed in hard work and the power of reinvention. Young Alfred would inherit both traits, along with something far more combustible, a burning need to prove that weakness could become strength. The Adler household hummed with middle-class aspiration. Leopold filled the home with talk of business and progress, while Alfred's mother, Pauline, kept the kitchen warm and the children anxiously monitored. Young Alfred absorbed it all, the striving, the competition between siblings, the sense that your place in the world wasn't fixed but fought for. The divorce was ugly. Freud, who'd positioned himself as the benevolent father of psychoanalysis, couldn't tolerate such filial rebellion. He wrote bitter letters calling Adler's theories paranoid and warning colleagues against Adlerian heresy. Adler, for his part, resigned from the society, with 9 other members, forming his own group. the Society for Free Psychoanalytic Research, later renamed Individual Psychology, a pointed reminder that Adler saw each person as indivisible and unique, not reducible to universal drives. As Adler packed his books and notes, leaving Burgasse 19 for the last time in 1911, he felt a curious mixture of liberation and loss. The mentor who'd opened doors had become the gatekeeper trying to trap him inside. But Adler had learned something crucial from those Wednesday evenings. New ideas required new language, new institutions, new communities willing to question orthodoxy. The socialist doctor who'd defended Freud's book 9 years earlier had become the movement's first major defector. The split reverberated through European intellectual circles. Who would follow Freud? Who would follow Adler? Who would try to straddle the impossible middle ground? Adler didn't look back. He had clinics to open, schools to advise, and an entirely different vision of human nature to develop. One where your past didn't have to define your future, where the youngest child could become a leader, where even the sickly boy from Rudolfsheim could change the world. The mild-mannered heretic was about to build his own empire, and it would be built not on couches for the wealthy, but in classrooms for the poor. Chapter 4. The Teacher's Therapist. If Freud's psychoanalysis was aristocratic, requiring years of expensive sessions on a velvet couch, Adler's individual psychology was decidedly democratic. Vienna, 1912. Freshly exiled from Freud's inner circle, Adler didn't retreat to private practice among the wealthy. Instead, he did something radical. He brought psychology to the people who needed it most. His first move was establishing child guidance clinics in Vienna's public schools. The concept was revolutionary. Bring the psychologist to where children actually live and learn, not wait for families wealthy enough to afford private treatment. Adler would sit in school rooms, observing children in their natural habitat, then meet with teachers and parents to discuss not pathology but potential. How could this aggressive boy channel his energy? What goals might motivate that withdrawn girl? The teachers loved him. Here was a psychologist who didn't speak in mystifying jargon about Oedipal complexes, but in practical terms about encouragement, cooperation, and social interest. Adler taught them to see misbehavior not as badness requiring punishment, but as mistaken attempts to find belonging. The child acting out probably feels inferior and is trying to gain attention. The perfect student might be overcompensating for deep insecurity. His approach was startlingly simple. Ask the child about their family position. Are you the oldest, the youngest, the only boy among sisters? Adler had developed his birth order theory, arguing that sibling position shaped personality in predictable ways. Oldest children become responsible and conservative, burdened by dethroned status when siblings arrive. Youngest children grow up pampered or driven to overtake everyone who came before. Middle children, masters of negotiation and competition. Only children, comfortable with adults but sometimes struggling with peers. Critics dismissed it as oversimplified. Adler shrugged. Of course it wasn't absolute, but it gave teachers and parents a useful starting framework. That was quintessentially Adlian, practical over precise, helpful over hermetic. By 1920, Adler had established more than 30 child guidance clinics across Vienna. Each Wednesday, he'd hold open consultations where parents presented problems, and Adler, in front of an audience of teachers, students, and curious citizens, would analyze the situation and offer advice. These public demonstrations were part theater, part pedagogy, completely unlike Freud's confidential sessions. Adler believed psychology should be democratized, made accessible, stripped of its mystique. His writings from this period reflect the same accessibility. While Freud penned dense theoretical tomes, Adler wrote articles for popular magazines with titles like "What Can We Do About Bad Habits?" and "Understanding the Difficult Child." He lectured to parent-teacher associations, workers' groups, and anyone who'd listen. His message was consistent. Children aren't driven by dark, unconscious forces, but by the need for belonging and significance. Give them constructive ways to feel important, and they'll thrive. Raisa, his wife, watched this democratic crusade with mixed feelings. She supported his work, but worried about money. Adler was giving away his expertise for free, or nearly so. "Someone has to make a living," she'd sigh, echoing what Engels once said about Marx. But Alfred couldn't help himself. He'd grown up in modest circumstances, had treated working-class patients in Leopoldstadt, and genuinely believed psychology should serve social justice. His most radical innovation came in teacher training. Adler insisted that educators learn basic psychology, that they understand how feelings of inferiority could be either crippling or motivating depending on how adults responded. He taught them about encouragement versus praise. Praising results, he argued, made children dependent on external validation. Encouraging effort taught resilience and self-worth. The distinction seems subtle, but Adler insisted it changed everything. By 1924, when educational reformers from around Europe visited Vienna to study progressive schooling, Adler's clinics were mandatory stops. They'd watch him interview a mother about her defiant son, gently revealing how the family dynamics, especially birth order and parenting style, created the very behavior everyone complained about. Then he'd suggest concrete changes, more responsibilities for the pampered youngest, less comparison between siblings, natural consequences instead of punishment. The school teacher's therapist had found his calling. Not curing the mentally ill in asylums, but preventing problems before they calcified. Not analyzing the past endlessly, but helping people, especially children, create better futures. It was psychology in service of education, mental health in service of democracy. And Vienna, that contradictory city of grandeur and poverty, became the laboratory where these ideas bloomed. At least until the political winds began to shift. The democracy Adler championed was about to face its greatest test, and his democratic psychology would soon need to find refuge far from its Viennese birthplace. Chapter 5. The Inferiority Complex Goes Global. The 1920s belonged to Adler in ways the 1910s had belonged to Freud. While his former mentor remained cloistered in Vienna, seeing a handful of wealthy neurotics, Adler took his message worldwide. The peripatetic psychologist spent these years crisscrossing Europe and eventually America, spreading individual psychology like some benevolent intellectual contagion. He lectured in packed halls, wrote best-selling books for general audiences, and gradually built a movement that rivaled and in some ways surpassed psychoanalysis in popular influence. His breakthrough came with the concept that made his name a household term: the inferiority complex. Adler had been developing the idea since his days treating organ inferiority, but in the 1920s he refined it into something the masses could understand. Everyone, he argued, begins life feeling inferior. We're small, dependent, incompetent compared to the adults around us. This isn't pathological, it's universal and motivating. The question isn't whether you feel inferior, but how you respond to that feeling. Healthy response. Use inferiority as fuel for growth, development, and contribution to society. Unhealthy response. Either give up in despair, inferiority complex, or overcompensate so dramatically you become grandiose and antisocial, superiority complex. The beauty of Adler's framework was its optimism. Feeling inferior meant you were normal, and with the right encouragement and social interest, you could transform that feeling into constructive striving. The concept exploded across popular culture. Newspapers ran advice columns about inferiority complexes. Novelists created characters wrestling with Adlerian struggles. Even Hollywood got involved. Mary Pickford, the silent film star, reportedly consulted Adler about her feelings of inadequacy despite massive success. The term entered everyday language so thoroughly that people forgot it came from somewhere, from someone. "Oh, he's just got an inferiority complex," became as common as saying "bless you" after a sneeze. In 1926, Adler made his first extended trip to America, lecturing at Columbia University and various educational institutions. Americans loved him. He was warm where Freud was cold, practical where Jung was mystical, optimistic where both seemed rather gloomy about human nature. American pragmatism and democratic ideals aligned perfectly with Adlerian psychology. Soon he was traveling to America annually, then eventually spending most of each year there, watching his ideas take root in American soil more successfully than they ever had in tradition-bound Europe. His writings from this period show Adler at his most accessible and influential. Understanding Human Nature became an international bestseller. What Life Should Mean to You laid out his mature philosophy in clear, jargon-free prose. He wrote about marriage equality decades before it was fashionable, about women's rights when psychology was overwhelmingly patriarchal, about the social responsibilities of parents and teachers and citizens. The little boy who couldn't breathe had found his voice, and the world was listening. But not everyone was applauding. Orthodox Freudians dismissed Adler's ideas as superficial, overly optimistic, insufficiently rigorous. Jung and his followers found Adler's materialism limiting. Where was the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the spiritual dimension? Even some of Adler's own followers worried he was diluting the message, making it too popular, too simplified. Adler's response was characteristically pragmatic. A theory that can't be understood by everyday people isn't worth much. The lectures became legendary. Adler would arrive, rumpled suit, thick glasses, modest demeanor, and proceed to captivate audiences for hours. He'd tell stories about children he'd worked with, analyze public figures' personalities based on biography and birth order. He loved speculating about Napoleon's youngest child's psychology, and weave it all into a coherent vision of human potential. People left his talks feeling not diagnosed but understood, not pathologized but encouraged. By 1929, the Long Island College of Medicine invited Adler to teach regular courses, effectively making him America's first professor of individual psychology. He divided his time between Vienna and New York, watching his child guidance clinic model spread across both continents. The movement had grown beyond him. Training institutes in Berlin, Amsterdam, London, and a dozen American cities. Books translated into multiple languages. A journal, the International Journal of Individual Psychology, disseminating research. Yet, even as his star rose, shadows lengthened over Europe. The economic collapse of 1929 created exactly the conditions Adler feared: mass feelings of inferiority without constructive outlets. In Germany and Austria, demagogues offered scapegoats and grandiose visions of racial superiority. Adler watched with growing horror as his democratic psychology faced its antithesis, fascism's cult of strength, its contempt for weakness, its brutal social Darwinism. The inferiority complex had gone global, all right, but so had something darker. And the Jewish psychologist who preached social interest and equality would soon face the ultimate test. Where do you stand when democracy itself is threatened? Chapter 6: Exile from the Couch. The Austria that Adler returned to in the early 1930s was barely recognizable. The coffeehouse culture that had nurtured his ideas now buzzed with darker conversations. Anti-Semitic newspapers sold openly on street corners. The social democratic government that had supported his child guidance clinics was losing ground to fascist movements. And in neighboring Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler was rising to power on a platform of racial superiority that stood as a grotesque parody of everything Adler had tried to teach about overcoming inferiority. The irony wasn't lost on Adler. Here was the inferiority complex weaponized, twisted into genocidal ideology. Hitler and his followers felt inferior and responded not with social interest but with paranoid grandiosity, projecting their inadequacies onto scapegoated minorities. Everything Adler had warned about, the dangers of unhealthy compensation, the catastrophic results when striving for superiority lacks social feeling, was metastasizing into political reality. By 1932, the situation had become untenable. Adler's clinics faced increasing harassment. His Jewish background, previously barely relevant in cosmopolitan Vienna, suddenly became dangerous. His democratic internationalist psychology was exactly the kind of cultural Bolshevism the rising fascists despised. When the Austrian government began aligning with fascist Italy, Adler understood what was coming. He made the wrenching decision to leave permanently. In 1934, at 64 years old, Adler emigrated to America, essentially abandoning the movement he'd built in Vienna. The farewell was characteristically low-key. No dramatic speeches, no manifestos. Just a quiet departure, carrying his essential papers and leaving behind 30 years of Viennese psychological infrastructure. America welcomed him warmly, but exile was still exile. Adler set up practice in New York, continued his lecture tours, and threw himself into establishing individual psychology in American institutions. But something had shifted. The man who'd brought psychology to the masses now watched helplessly as the masses in his homeland embraced fascism. His letters from this period reveal a growing fatalism beneath the usual optimistic veneer. His family was scattered, children establishing their own lives, Reiser managing their affairs with characteristic efficiency. At an age when most psychologists retired to write memoirs, Adler maintained a punishing schedule. He lectured constantly, traveled obsessively, and seemed unable or unwilling to slow down. Friends worried about his health. He'd never been robust, and the stress of exile compounded decades of overwork. In 1937, he embarked on a European lecture tour, part reunion with old colleagues, part anxious checking on the state of his movement under increasingly oppressive conditions. He visited Scotland, England, the Netherlands, anywhere his ideas still had purchase, anywhere the lights of democracy hadn't yet been extinguished. In Aberdeen, Scotland, he delivered what would be his final lectures, speaking to teachers and psychologists about the power of encouragement, the dangers of authoritarianism, the necessity of social interest. On May 28, 1937, Adler took his usual morning walk through Aberdeen's streets. The 67-year-old psychologist collapsed on Union Street, suffering a massive heart attack. He was pronounced dead shortly after at the Royal Infirmary. The boy who'd barely survived childhood, who'd overcome rickets and pneumonia and his brother's shadow, who'd revolutionized psychology and brought hope to millions, his heart simply gave out on a Scottish sidewalk, far from Vienna, far from home. The funeral was modest, attended by local colleagues and a handful of family members who could reach Scotland in time. No grand ceremonies, no processions through Vienna's streets. The newspapers carried brief obituaries, noting his role as Freud's early colleague and his theory of inferiority complexes, getting almost everything else wrong. History, it seemed, wasn't quite ready to recognize what he'd accomplished. Back in Vienna, his child guidance clinics were systematically dismantled by the Nazi authorities. His books were burned along with Freud's and other degenerate Jewish psychologists. The schools where he'd taught democratic values were transformed into Hitler Youth indoctrination centers. Everything he'd built was being erased, as if those decades of work had been written in water. Yet, even as fascism tried to extinguish his legacy, Adler's ideas were taking root elsewhere, in American schools, in British educational reform, in resistance movements that used his concepts of social interest and community to combat totalitarian atomization. The man who'd preached that your future matters more than your past was about to have his theory tested posthumously. Could his ideas survive their own past, the destruction of their birthplace, and create a new future? The exile from the couch had become eternal, But the conversations he'd started were just beginning to shape the world he'd left behind. Chapter 7. The Orphaned Ideas. Death has a way of clarifying intellectual lineages, and Adler's passing in 1937 forced a reckoning. What exactly had he contributed to psychology? Freud still loomed large, Jung had his mystical devotees, but Adler? His ideas had been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture and educational practice that tracing them back to their source became nearly impossible. He'd wanted to democratize psychology, and he'd succeeded so completely that his own name nearly vanished in the process. In America, the center of Adlerian psychology shifted to Rudolf Dreikurs, a Viennese psychiatrist who'd emigrated to Chicago. Dreikurs became Adler's most dedicated apostle, teaching generations of counselors and educators about democratic child rearing, natural consequences, and family dynamics. He refined Adler's birth order theories, developed practical classroom management techniques based on encouragement, and kept individual psychology alive through the dark war years when Europe's intellectual traditions were being systematically destroyed. But something curious happened as Adler's ideas spread. They became invisible precisely because they were so influential. When teachers learned about encouragement over punishment, they didn't think, "This is Adlerian psychology." When therapists explored life goals and future orientation rather than past trauma, they weren't necessarily identifying as Adlerians. When family counselors analyzed sibling dynamics, they might not realize they were applying concepts Adler pioneered. His theories had become the water in which psychology swam, so pervasive they seemed like common sense. Meanwhile, the Freudian establishment worked hard to minimize Adler's contributions. He was portrayed as an early defector who never understood psychoanalysis, whose theories were superficial, whose optimism was naive. The narrative became, Freud was the profound genius, Jung the mystical explorer, and Adler, well, he had that thing about inferiority complexes. Never mind that he'd essentially invented social psychology, community mental health, and holistic medicine decades before those fields formally existed. The post-war years brought partial rehabilitation. As psychology moved away from Freud's rigid orthodoxies, researchers rediscovered Adler's emphasis on social factors, cognitive processes, and goal-oriented behavior. Abraham Maslow, developing his hierarchy of needs, cited Adler as a key influence, particularly the idea that humans are motivated by growth and self-actualization, not just drives and defenses. Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy echoed Adlerian emphasis on empathy, encouragement, and the client's own goals. Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, founding cognitive therapy, built on Adler's insight that thoughts and beliefs shape emotions and behavior. They were all, consciously or not, working in Adlerian territory. The difference? They had better marketing. By the 1960s, cognitive therapy and humanistic psychology were hot new movements. Individual psychology was seen as something your grandfather studied, if he studied psychology at all. Adler had won the intellectual argument but lost the branding war. His birth order theories became particularly contested. Researchers would periodically announce they'd debunked birth order effects. Then other researchers would find evidence supporting them. Then the cycle would repeat. The truth was more nuanced than either side admitted. Birth order wasn't destiny. Adler never claimed it was. But it did create different family experiences that could shape personality, especially in interaction with parenting style, family values, and countless other variables. But nuance doesn't make headlines. The child guidance clinic model Adler pioneered became standard practice worldwide. School psychologists, family therapists, community mental health centers, all built on his foundation of bringing services to where people live rather than waiting for crisis. Yet how many practitioners knew they were implementing Adlerian principles? The ideas had been orphaned from their creator, adopted by the mainstream and given new names. By the 1970s and 80s, individual psychology existed primarily in scattered institutes and training centers, kept alive by dedicated but aging practitioners. The Adler School of Professional Psychology in Chicago, the North American Society of Adlerian Psychology, various European societies, they preserved the tradition but struggled to compete with more fashionable therapeutic approaches. Adler became the forgotten founder, the psychologist everyone had heard of but nobody could quite explain. Yet something fascinating was happening beneath the surface. Parenting books absorbed Adlerian concepts wholesale. How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, the best-selling parenting guide, was essentially Draco's Adlerian principles repackaged. The birth order book became a phenomenon by popularizing ideas Adler had developed 70 years earlier. Even business leadership training began incorporating concepts like social interest, rebranded as servant leadership, and encouragement, now positive reinforcement. The orphaned ideas had found foster homes everywhere. They'd lost their father's name, but kept his spirit. Democratic, practical, hopeful about human potential. Whether Adler would have been pleased or frustrated by this invisible influence remains one of psychology's great unanswerable questions. He'd wanted his ideas accessible to everyone, mission accomplished. He'd wanted credit for changing the field, less successful. As the century wound down, a curious phenomenon emerged. Therapists would independently develop approaches they thought were novel, only to discover Adler had been there first. The pattern repeated so often, it became a joke among historians of psychology. Everything you've discovered, Adler said in 1925. The forgotten founder kept getting rediscovered. His insights so ahead of their time, they seemed contemporary decades later. The ghost in the therapy office was still there, quietly encouraging, patiently waiting for the field to catch up. Chapter 8. The Democratic Revolution Nobody Noticed. While Freud's couch became an icon of 20th century culture and Jung's archetypes inspired countless artists and mystics, Adler's revolution happened so quietly that few noticed it was a revolution at all. Yet by the end of the century, his fingerprints were everywhere, on parenting, education, therapy, and our basic assumptions of human nature. The democratic psychologist had democratized psychology itself, making it a tool for ordinary people rather than a priesthood for the initiated. Take parenting. Before Adler, conventional wisdom held that children needed strict discipline, clear hierarchy, and swift punishment for misbehavior. Freud had complicated things with Oedipal dynamics and unconscious desires, but hadn't fundamentally challenged authoritarian child-rearing. Adler did. He argued that children misbehave not from badness, but from discouragement, that they need encouragement, not praise, natural consequences, not punishment, and above all, they need to feel they belong and contribute to the family. By century's end, these ideas weren't revolutionary, they were mainstream. Every parenting magazine, every school counselor, every child development expert preached some version of Adlerian principles. The revolution had succeeded so completely it became invisible. Education followed a similar arc. Adler's insistence that schools address the whole child, emotional needs alongside academic performance seemed radical in 1920s Vienna. By the 1990s, it was educational orthodoxy. Social-emotional learning programs, restorative justice practices, positive behavior interventions, all built on Adlerian foundations about encouragement, belonging, and social interest. Teachers learned to see behavior problems as communication about unmet needs for significance and connection. Students were taught cooperation and contribution alongside mathematics and reading. Even therapy underwent an Adlerian revolution disguised as multiple smaller movements. Cognitive behavioral therapies focus on thoughts shaping feelings. Adler had argued that in the 1910s, calling them private logic and lifestyle convictions. Solution-focused therapy's emphasis on goals and future orientation rather than past problems. Pure Adlerian philosophy. Family systems therapy's attention to birth order and sibling dynamics, straight from Adler's playbook. Positive psychology's research on growth, resilience, and meaning, essentially a research program validating Adler's optimistic view of human nature. The irony was delicious. Psychology had spent decades dismissing Adler as superficial and unscientific, then proceeded to rediscover his insights piece by piece, giving them new names and claiming them as innovations. It was like watching someone reject their grandfather's advice, then spend 30 years learning the same lessons the hard way and calling it progress. But perhaps the deepest revolution was conceptual. Adler had dared to suggest that personality wasn't fixed by age 5, that the unconscious wasn't all-powerful, that people were pulled toward goals as much as pushed by drives, and that social connection was as fundamental as sexuality. These ideas, heretical in Freud's Vienna, became the assumptions underlying most contemporary psychology. We now take for granted that people can change throughout life, that conscious goals matter, that relationships and social context shape behavior. We barely remember these weren't always obvious truths. The self-help industry became Adler's unexpected legacy. Every book promising you can overcome your past, every seminar teaching goal setting and positive thinking, every motivational speaker preaching the power of attitude, they're all echoing Adlerian themes, usually without knowing it. He'd wanted psychology accessible to the masses. The masses took his ideas and turned them into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Whether he'd be pleased or horrified by The Secret and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, citing vaguely Adlerian principles, is anyone's guess. By the turn of the millennium, assessment of Adler's influence had become a parlor game among psychology historians. They'd count the ways he'd been proven right. Emphasis on social factors? Check. Importance of meaning and purpose? Check. Power of encouragement over criticism? Check. Role of birth order within limits? Check. Future orientation in therapy? Check. Yet, despite this intellectual vindication, Adler remained the discipline's forgotten founder, the psychologist everyone had absorbed without reading. The democratic revolution nobody noticed had succeeded beyond its architect's wildest dreams. Psychology was no longer confined to Vienna consulting rooms where wealthy neurotics unpacked childhood trauma. It was in schools and community centers, in parenting books and workplace training, in how we talk about feelings and understand behavior. Adler had wanted to bring psychology to the people. The people had taken it, remade it, and incorporated it into everyday life so thoroughly that distinguishing Adlerian ideas from common sense became nearly impossible. The modest man from Rudolfsheim who'd overcome rickets and pneumonia, who'd challenged Freud and lost the branding war, who died on a Scottish sidewalk far from home, he'd won after all. Not the kind of victory that gets monuments and ticker tape parades. The quiet kind that changes how millions of people understand themselves and raise their children. The democratic kind that doesn't need a single great man's name attached because the ideas belong to everyone now. Chapter 9. Adler in the Age of Anxiety. If Adler were to materialize in our contemporary world, perhaps summoned by a stressed-out millennial therapist or the collective anxiety of an entire generation, he'd find both validation and horror in equal measure. The 21st century has become a laboratory testing his theories at unprecedented scale. Social media amplifies feelings of inferiority to toxic levels. The self-help industry he accidentally spawned has metastasized into wellness culture and toxic positivity. Yet his core insights about belonging, encouragement, and social interest feel more relevant than ever in our fragmented, hyper-individualistic age. Take the inferiority complex in the digital era. Adler wrote about children comparing themselves to siblings and parents. Today's teenagers compare themselves to thousands of carefully curated highlight reels on Instagram. The mechanism is identical. Perceived inadequacy driving either healthy striving or pathological despair, but the scale is unprecedented. Every scroll reveals someone prettier, richer, more successful, seemingly happier. Adler would recognize the pattern instantly. Mass inferiority feelings without the social interest and community support to channel them constructively. The superiority complex has found new expressions too. Hustle culture and its toxic positivity, the relentless insistence that you can achieve anything if you just work hard enough, looks suspiciously like unhealthy overcompensation. The self-made billionaires preaching meritocracy while exploiting workers, classic superiority complex masking deep insecurity. Adler's warning about striving for superiority without social feeling could be the diagnosis for much of contemporary capitalism's pathology. Yet, there's hope in unexpected places. The mental health awareness movement, destigmatizing therapy and emotional struggles, is pure Adlerian spirit. When celebrities discuss their anxiety or depression publicly, they're doing what Adler advocated, normalizing human vulnerability, showing that feeling inferior or struggling doesn't make you defective. The proliferation of support groups, online communities, and peer counseling reflects his democratic vision of psychology as mutual aid rather than expert-to-patient hierarchy. Birth order theories have found new life in the digital age, though often in bastardized form. Pop psychology articles reduce Adler's nuanced observations to clickbait. 10 signs you're a middle child, or why firstborns make better CEOs. He'd probably cringe at the oversimplification, while appreciating that people find the framework useful. The research remains mixed. Some studies find birth order effects, others don't. But Adler never claimed it was deterministic, just one factor among many shaping how we learn to find our place. The workplace has become an Adlerian laboratory, often without realizing it. Concepts like psychological safety and belonging and inclusion are essentially social interest rebranded for corporate America. When companies invest in employee well-being and emphasize purpose over pure profit, they're, sometimes cynically, sometimes genuinely, applying Adlerian principles. The most effective modern leadership training teaches encouragement over criticism, empowerment over control, straight from Adler's playbook, even if his name never appears. Education has seen both Adlerian triumphs and betrayals. The emphasis on social-emotional learning, restorative justice, and growth mindset all reflect his influence. Yet standardized testing culture and hyper-competition for college admissions create exactly the pathological comparison and discouragement he warned against. Modern schools simultaneously preach his values and violate them, creating a bizarre cognitive dissonance that would fascinate and frustrate him. Parenting has perhaps remained most faithful to Adlerian principles, at least in progressive circles. Gentle parenting, positive discipline, and democratic family structures all trace back to his revolutionary claim that children respond better to encouragement than punishment. The viral parenting advice on TikTok and Instagram often unknowingly channels Drakehurst and Adler. Natural consequences instead of arbitrary punishment, family meetings where children have a voice, understanding misbehavior as communication about unmet needs. The mental health crisis, particularly among young people, would break Adler's heart while validating his theories. Skyrocketing anxiety and depression rates correlate with declining social connection and community involvement. Precisely the social interest deficit he predicted would cause psychological suffering. Loneliness epidemics, political polarization, and environmental despair all reflect what happens when individual striving detaches from collective welfare. We're living through a massive experiment in what society looks like with inferiority feelings but without community to channel them productively. Yet therapy itself has become remarkably Adlerian, even when practitioners don't identify as such. The emphasis on client goals rather than pathology, the collaborative relationship rather than expert interpretation, the focus on strengths and resilience alongside problems. These are all positions Adler staked out against Freud a century ago. Cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, solution-focused therapy, they're all his grandchildren, even if they don't always acknowledge their grandfather. The most profound validation of Adler's vision might be the current understanding of trauma and resilience. Research has confirmed his radical claim. What matters isn't just what happens to you, but how you interpret it, what meaning you make of it, and whether you have community support. Two people experience identical adversity. One develops PTSD, another experiences post-traumatic growth. The difference? Often the very factors Adler identified: sense of purpose, social connections, encouragement rather than pity, opportunity to contribute and feel significant. As we navigate climate anxiety, political upheaval, and technological disruption, Adler's central question echoes louder: what kind of future are we creating together? His insistence that psychology must serve social justice and democratic values, not just individual adjustment, feels urgently relevant. In an age of radical individualism, he reminds us that mental health is inseparable from community health. In an age of despair, he offers tempered optimism. We're not prisoners of our past or our biology, and small changes in how we relate to each other can ripple into transformative effects. The sickly boy from Vienna who dared suggest personality was something we create rather than inherit would find our world both alarming and full of potential. The inferiority complex has gone viral, literally. But so has the understanding that we're all in this together, that encouragement matters, that our future depends on cultivating social interest in an age of isolation. The democratic revolution continues, one conversation, one encouraged child, one connected community at a time. Chapter 10: The Invisible Founder's Visible Legacy. Step into any modern therapy office, classroom, or progressive workplace, and you're walking into an Adlerian world. You just might not know it. The consulting room, where therapists and clients sit facing each other as equals rather than doctor hovering over supine patient. Adler pioneered that. The teacher who responds to misbehavior by asking, "What are you trying to accomplish?" rather than, "Why are you being bad?" That's Adler psychology in action. The manager who focuses on team cohesion and shared purpose, social interest with a corporate badge. The assessment of Adler's influence requires acknowledging a paradox. He's simultaneously the most forgotten and most influential of psychology's founders. Walk into any university and ask students about Freud. They'll mention the unconscious, repression, Oedipal complexes. Ask about Jung, archetypes, collective unconscious, personality types. Ask about Adler. Oh, the inferiority complex guy. And that's if you're lucky. Yet probe deeper into what these students actually believe about psychology, and you'll find Adlerian assumptions everywhere. They believe personality develops throughout life, not just in early childhood. They think goals and aspirations matter as much as past traumas. They assume social relationships fundamentally shape who we are. They take for granted that therapy should be collaborative and time-limited, focused on practical problems and future possibilities. They've absorbed Adlerian psychology so thoroughly, they think it's just psychology, period. The invisible founder has achieved the ultimate influence. His revolutionary ideas became common sense. Academic psychology's relationship with Adler remains complicated. Research has validated many of his core claims while complicating others. Birth order effects? Real, but modest and context-dependent. Exactly the nuanced position Adler actually held, despite popular oversimplification. Social factors in personality development? Now considered fundamental, with entire subdisciplines studying social cognition and interpersonal neurobiology. Goal-oriented behavior? Central to contemporary motivational psychology. The importance of meaning and purpose? Now an entire research program called positive psychology, with hundreds of studies confirming Adler's claims about self-actualization and contribution. Yet Adler rarely gets credited for these prescient insights. The field has a curious amnesia about its own history. Researchers discover that encouragement works better than criticism. Apparently unaware, Adler demonstrated this in Viennese classrooms a century ago. Positive psychologists announce that meaning and social connection predict well-being, as if this wasn't Adler's central argument. Cognitive therapists celebrate focusing on thoughts and beliefs, forgetting Adler called them private logic and lifestyle convictions decades before cognitive therapy existed. The parenting world has been perhaps most faithful to Adler's vision, creating a direct lineage from his child guidance clinics to contemporary gentle parenting movements. The books lining the shelves of anxious parents, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, Positive Discipline, The Whole Brain Child, are all variations on Adlerian themes. Encouragement over praise, natural consequences over punishment, democratic family meetings, understanding misbehavior as communication, family constellation and birth order considerations. Adler would recognize every principle, even if his name appears nowhere in the text. Education has seen similar adoption without attribution. Social-emotional learning programs teaching cooperation, empathy, and problem-solving. Adlerian community feeling packaged for school districts. Restorative justice practices repairing relationships rather than simply punishing. Pure Adlerian emphasis on belonging and contribution. Growth mindset teaching that abilities develop through effort. Adler's argument that inferiority feelings can fuel healthy striving with better neuroscience backing. The most surprising arena of Adlerian influence might be business and leadership training. Servant leadership, emphasizing leaders' responsibility to serve their team. That's social interest in a suit and tie. Strengths-based management, focusing on what people do well rather than fixing weaknesses. Adlerian encouragement applied to quarterly reviews. Team-building exercises fostering cooperation and shared purpose. Community feeling meets corporate culture. Even psychological safety, the hottest concept in organizational psychology, is essentially Adler's insight that people need to feel they belong and can contribute without fear of humiliation. Psychotherapy itself has become unrecognizably Adlerian compared to Freud's original vision. Time-limited treatment focused on specific goals? Check. Collaborative relationship where client is expert on their own life. Check. Emphasis on strengths and resilience alongside problems. Check. Understanding symptoms in social and cultural context. Check. Most contemporary therapy, regardless of theoretical label, operates on Adlerian principles about human nature. We are social creatures oriented toward goals, shaped by meanings we create, capable of change throughout life. The self-help industry represents Adler's most dubious legacy. On one hand, his democratic vision of psychology accessible to all has been realized. Millions of people engage with psychological concepts through books, podcasts, and apps without ever seeing a therapist. On the other hand, his nuanced ideas have been flattened into toxic positivity and oversimplified formula. "You create your own reality," proclaims a seminar leader, apparently missing Adler's careful balance between personal agency and social context. "Just overcome your inferiority complex," chirps a self-help guru, ignoring Adler's point that feeling inferior is normal and can be productive with proper encouragement and community. Yet, there's hope in unexpected places. The mental health awareness movement, destigmatizing therapy and emotional struggles, is pure Adlerian spirit. When celebrities discuss their anxiety or depression publicly, they're doing what Adler advocated, normalizing human vulnerability, showing that feeling inferior or struggling doesn't make you defective. The proliferation of support groups, online communities, and peer counseling reflects his democratic vision of psychology as mutual aid rather than expert-to-patient hierarchy. The modest man who died on a Scottish sidewalk, whose clinics were destroyed and books burned, whose name was nearly forgotten while his ideas conquered the world. He'd probably shrug at all the attention. Then he'd ask the practical question: how do we use these insights to help people? How do we build more encouraging schools, more democratic, more connected communities? The legacy isn't about remembering Alfred Adler. It's about living in the more humane world his psychology helped create. Chapter 11. The Prophet of Possibility. As the decades rolled on past Adler's death, a curious pattern emerged. Every time psychology seemed to abandon his principles, reality would rudely reassert them. The 1950s and 60s saw behaviorism dominate. Humans as stimulus response machines, empty vessels shaped entirely by conditioning. Then, researchers started noticing cognitive processes, goals, and meanings matter after all. Adler's ghost whispered, "I told you so," from the cemetery. The 1970s brought biological reductionism. Personality is genetic, hardwired, unchangeable. Then, neuroscience discovered plasticity, and longitudinal studies showed people do change throughout life. The ghost whispered again. The pattern wasn't that Adler was always right. No theorist is. But he'd staked out a middle ground between extremes that kept proving remarkably durable. Not purely biological or purely environmental, but both in interaction. Not determined by the past or free-floating without history, but shaped by how we interpret what happened and where we're heading. Not entirely conscious rational actors, or entirely driven by unconscious forces, but both self-aware and self-deceiving in complex ways. His synthetic vision kept being rediscovered because it matched lived experience better than purist positions on either side. The cognitive revolution of the 1970s and 80s represented perhaps the fullest vindication of Adler's approach. After decades of behaviorism insisting consciousness doesn't matter, and psychoanalysis claiming the unconscious is everything, cognitive psychologists announced a revelation: thoughts shape emotions and behavior. Beliefs matter. How you interpret events determines their impact. Cognitive therapists like Ellis and Beck built entire treatment models on these insights, and they worked remarkably well. Research confirmed that changing dysfunctional thought patterns relieves depression and anxiety. What few mentioned was that Adler had been teaching this since 1910. His concept of private logic, the personal beliefs and assumptions that guide behavior, was essentially cognitive schemas 50 years early. His emphasis on lifestyle patterns and fictional goals prefigured cognitive therapy's focus on core beliefs and automatic thoughts. Even the collaborative, present-focused, goal-oriented structure of CBT sessions echoed Adlerian practice. The cognitive revolution was partly an Adlerian restoration, though Adler rarely got credit for it. Positive psychology's emergence in the 1990s brought another Adlerian renaissance disguised as innovation. Martin Seligman and colleagues announced they were shifting focus from pathology to well-being, from fixing problems to building strengths, from past wounds to future possibilities. They studied meaning, purpose, growth, resilience, and social connection, essentially researching Adler's core themes with better methodology and fMRI machines. To their credit, positive psychologists often acknowledged Adler as a forerunner, even if he wasn't their primary inspiration. But the vindication went beyond academic psychology. Neuroscience confirmed that social connection and belonging are neurological imperatives, not just nice-to-have luxuries. Attachment research showed that early relationships shape development, but also that later relationships can heal early wounds, supporting Adler's optimism about change. Epigenetics revealed that environment affects genetic expression, validating his interactionist position against strict genetic determinism. Developmental psychology demonstrated that meaning-making and narrative identity continue evolving throughout life, exactly as Adler proposed. Even birth order research, often cited as Adler's most dubious contribution, turned out more nuanced than either champions or critics claimed. Large-scale studies found small but real birth order effects on personality, especially for traits like openness and conscientiousness. The effects were modest, context-dependent, and operated through family dynamics, exactly as Adler described. Not biological destiny, but differential experience based on family position. He'd been more right than wrong, though not as definitively as pop psychology suggested. The prophet of possibility's greatest vindication came from an unexpected source: longitudinal studies tracking people across decades. These studies, which Adler never lived to see, confirmed his most radical claim, that personality isn't fixed. People change substantially throughout adulthood, often in response to life circumstances, relationships, and deliberate efforts at self-improvement. The idea that character is set by age 5, so central to classical psychoanalysis, turned out to be empirically wrong. Adler's optimism about human plasticity was scientific fact, not wishful thinking. This mattered enormously for therapy and education. If people can change, then intervention makes sense at any age. If goals and meanings shape behavior, then helping people clarify values and purposes is therapeutic. If social connection is fundamental, then building community is mental health infrastructure. If encouragement promotes growth, while criticism promotes defensiveness, then how we relate to struggling individuals actually matters. These weren't just theoretical positions, they had practical implications that Adler had been implementing since his first child guidance clinic. Yet, as his ideas triumphed empirically, Adler's name faded further into obscurity. The mechanisms of academic and popular psychology are cruel. Being right decades too early means watching others rediscover your insights and claim them as original. Adler's synthesis, future-oriented, social, optimistic, practical, became the water in which psychology swam. So pervasive, it seemed like natural truth rather than one theorist's revolutionary vision. By the early 21st century, assessment of Adler required separating the man from the movement, from the ideas themselves. The man, humble, hard-working, sincerely committed to social justice, remained admirable even to critics. The movement, individual psychology as an organized school, had dwindled to scattered institutes and training centers, never recovering from Adler's death and WW2's devastation. But the ideas? They'd infiltrated everything, changing the entire field's landscape even as the field forgot who'd planted the seeds. The prophet of possibility had prophesied accurately. Humans are creative, social, forward-looking creatures who construct meanings, pursue goals, and shape their own development in interaction with environment and relationships. A century of research confirmed this vision, usually without acknowledging its source. Whether Adler would be satisfied with this invisible influence or frustrated by the lack of recognition remains one of psychology's unanswerable questions. Probably both. But then, holding contradictory feelings simultaneously, that's very human. Adler would understand. Chapter 12. Encouragement in the Age of Despair. If any moment in history needed Adleria's psychology, it's ours. The 2020s arrived like a series of escalating catastrophes. Pandemic, political upheaval, climate crisis, mental health collapse. The very fabric of social connection Adler identified as fundamental to well-being has been shredded. Loneliness reaches epidemic levels. Anxiety and depression rates, especially among young people, skyrocket. Collective meaning and shared purpose, that social interest Adler considered humanity's salvation, seem quaint relics of a more innocent time. Yet, paradoxically, this crisis has sparked renewed interest in exactly what Adler prescribed. When the pandemic forced isolation, we discovered viscerally what he'd known intellectually. Human beings need community not as luxury, but as psychological oxygen. The Zoom calls and FaceTime sessions we used to maintain connection, inadequate substitutes for in-person contact, nonetheless demonstrated our desperate need for belonging. Mental health professionals watched clients deteriorate not primarily from virus fear, but from social deprivation. Adler's ghost nodded knowingly from whatever corner of the universe dead psychologists inhabit. The mental health crisis among adolescents and young adults presents a particularly Adlerian picture. Rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide have risen dramatically, especially since 2010. The timing correlates suspiciously with smartphone ubiquity and social media saturation, technologies that promise connection while delivering comparison and inadequacy. Every Instagram scroll triggers precisely what Adler warned about: pathological striving for superiority without social interest, inferiority feelings without community support to channel them productively, belonging replaced by performance for invisible audiences. The response, when it's come, has been remarkably Adlerian in spirit, if not in name. Mental health awareness campaigns work to destigmatize struggle and normalize vulnerability. Exactly Adler's project of making psychology accessible and non-pathologizing. Peer support networks and mutual aid groups embody his vision of democratic helping rather than expert-to-patient hierarchy. The emphasis on connection, purpose, and contribution in addressing depression reflects his core insights about human needs. Even workplace well-being programs, however imperfectly implemented, gesture toward his insistence that mental health requires humane social structures. Climate anxiety presents an especially interesting test of Adlerian principles. Young people facing planetary catastrophe experience exactly the conditions that could trigger either healthy social interest or nihilistic despair. Will feelings of inadequacy in face of massive problems fuel constructive collective action, or will they collapse into helplessness and withdrawal? Adler would argue the difference depends on encouragement, community, and opportunity to contribute meaningfully, precisely what climate activists emphasize when they combat despair through solidarity and shared purpose. The polarization tearing apart democracies worldwide represents the dark inverse of social interest. When groups define themselves primarily in opposition to others, when empathy stops at tribal boundaries, when winning matters more than collective well-being, these are textbook examples of superiority striving without community feeling. Adler's prescription would be simple if not easy. Rebuild connections across divisions, emphasize shared humanity and common fate, create structures that reward cooperation over domination. Easier said than done in an age of algorithmic rage and manufactured outrage, but the diagnosis remains sound. Technology's role in our current crisis would fascinate Adler. Social media amplifies exactly the psychological dynamics he studied: comparison and inferiority, performance and superiority striving, fragile self-worth dependent on external validation. Yet technology also enables connection across distance, access to support and information, and organizing collective action at unprecedented scale. The tools are neutral. What matters is whether we use them to foster genuine community or simulate it with parasocial substitutes. The return to emphasizing encouragement in parenting and education, accelerated by pandemic stress, revealing how much criticism damages struggling children, vindicated Adler's lifetime advocacy. Teachers and parents watching children collapse under pressure and comparison rediscovered that encouragement builds resilience while shame breeds defensiveness. The research was always there supporting Adler's position, but sometimes cultures need crises to overcome inertia and actually implement what evidence recommends. Therapy's evolution continues in Adlerian directions, even as practitioners rarely identify as such. Trauma-informed care emphasizes safety, connection, and meaning-making, all Adlerian themes. The move toward integrative and eclectic approaches over theoretical purity mirrors Adler's pragmatic synthesis. Teletherapy's democratizing effect, making services more accessible and affordable, realizes his vision of bringing psychology to the people. The emphasis on cultural humility and social justice in clinical training reflects his insistence that individual psychology and social context are inseparable. Perhaps most surprisingly, the corporate world, hardly known for humanistic values, has absorbed Adlerian principles into organizational psychology and leadership training. The recognition that psychological safety, belonging, and purpose drive performance better than fear and competition, that's social interest meeting bottom-line thinking. The research showing that encouragement and development opportunity retain talent, while criticism and control lose it. Adler could have told them that in 1920. Better late than never, he'd probably say, though he'd remain skeptical of applying his democratic psychology in service of profit maximization rather than human flourishing. The various crises of our age, mental health, climate, inequality, polarization, all trace back to what Adler identified as the fundamental human problem: balancing individual striving with community belonging. We've built societies that encourage competition over cooperation, individual achievement over collective well-being, short-term gain over long-term flourishing. The results are exactly what he predicted: widespread feelings of inadequacy and disconnection, unhealthy compensation through domination or withdrawal, and eroded social interest, making collective problems unsolvable. Yet Adler would resist despair, just as he resisted it in 1930s Vienna, watching democracy collapse into fascism. His temperamental optimism wasn't naive. He'd survived childhood illness, poverty, professional ostracism, and exile. It was philosophical, grounded in his conviction that human beings are remarkably adaptive when given encouragement, community, and opportunity for meaningful contribution. Even in darkest times, small acts of connection and encouragement create ripples. Even when social structures fail, individuals can choose to live with social interest, creating islands of humanity in seas of alienation. The encouragement we need in the age of despair isn't toxic positivity pretending everything's fine. It's realistic hopefulness, acknowledging the difficulties while maintaining faith in collective human capacity to muddle through. It's the kind Adler practiced in his clinics, seeing people's strengths alongside their struggles, believing in possibility while respecting reality, offering community rather than judgment. The sickly boy who became a healer, the socialist who democratized psychology, the exile who kept teaching until his heart gave out. He'd tell us what he told generations of discouraged parents and teachers. Small changes in how we relate can ripple into transformation. Start where you are. Do what you can. Together. Epilogue. The spectre that still encourages. And that's the story of Alfred Adler, the man who saw psychology's potential to empower rather than pathologize, and spent his life making mental health insights accessible to everyone. Before you drift off to sleep, let's retrace his extraordinary journey through the fog of history. We began in Vienna's Rudolfsheim district, where a sickly boy with twisted legs and a healthy brother's shadow grew up between inferiority and determination. That young Alfred, struggling yet stubborn and allergic to limitations others tried to place on him, would become the psychologist who democratized mental health and proved that weakness could become strength. Then came medical school and the working-class clinics, where he discovered something radical. People compensate for inadequacy, transforming vulnerability into achievement. Those circus performers and factory workers taught him more about human psychology than any textbook. The socialist doctor was learning that context matters, that bodies and minds connect, that everyone has potential for growth. Vienna's psychological society and the fateful encounter with Freud. The Wednesday evenings became battlegrounds as Adler questioned psychoanalytic orthodoxy. Picture him there, bespectacled and earnest, daring to suggest that the future matters more than the past, that social interest matters more than sexuality. The heretic was born, leaving Freud's circle to build his own vision. The child guidance clinics became his revolution, bringing psychology to public schools, teaching parents and teachers about encouragement rather than punishment, about birth order and belonging. The inferiority complex went global, making Adler briefly famous while his deeper insights remained underappreciated. Through it all, personal joys and sorrows, a fierce wife and partner, children to raise, exile from everything he'd built as fascism rose. After his death on that Scottish sidewalk, history treated his ideas with curious generosity and his name with puzzling neglect. His concepts became common sense while he became a footnote. Yet walk into any modern therapy office, classroom, or thoughtful workplace, and you're walking into an Adlerian world, one where encouragement builds resilience, where social connection matters fundamentally, where people can change throughout life if given support and purpose. So, why does Adler matter tonight? Because whether you're nodding off after doom scrolling through climate news or just wondering why you feel so disconnected despite being constantly online, his central insight remains. We're social creatures who need belonging, encouragement, and meaningful contribution to thrive. The mental health crisis, the loneliness epidemic, the polarization tearing communities apart, they're all symptoms of inadequate social interest in an age that desperately needs it. Now, as the candle of history flickers low, let's leave Adler where we found him, in that Viennese schoolroom, encouraging a discouraged child, teaching the radical idea that your past doesn't determine your future, that feeling inferior is normal and can fuel healthy growth with proper support, that we're all in this together. The democratic revolution continues, one encouraged person at a time. The rest, dear listener, is up to us. If these journeys into history help you unwind, do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you about Adler's story? And who should we explore next? Now, close your eyes. Let these ideas drift. And remember, you're more capable of change than you think, more connected to others than you feel, and more needed in this world than you know. Sleep well.